In old Hollywood, the camera captured everything except the truth. Beneath the surface of red carpets, glittering premieres, and studio-fabricated smiles, some of the most iconic stars harbored secrets so profound they would have shattered the very images that made them famous. In a town where reinvention was not just encouraged, but expected, the truth was often the first casualty. These are the 17 old Hollywood stars who hid their true identities from the world. And number 10? It may be the most shocking secret of them all. 1. Rock Hudson, the tragic secret of Hollywood's ideal man. To the world, Rock Hudson was the embodiment of masculine perfection. Towering, square-jawed, and irresistibly charming, he became the romantic lead that millions of women dreamed about and countless men envied. Whether he was sweeping Doris Day off her feet in a breezy romantic comedy or commanding attention in sweeping dramas, Hudson exuded effortless confidence. But behind that crafted image lay a secret he could never speak. Rock Hudson was a gay man, living in an era that would have destroyed him if that truth were known. His homosexuality wasn't just discouraged, it was a career-ending liability. The studio system, with its rigid control over stars' personal lives, orchestrated fake relationships, publicity stunts, and rumors of secret romances with women to protect their investment in his image. Hudson was even pushed into a brief arranged marriage with his agent's secretary, Phyllis Gates, a move designed purely to silence tabloid whispers. Friends close to him knew the truth, of course. Hollywood insiders whispered about his private parties and the company he kept. But the unspoken rule was simple: keep it buried or lose everything. And so, Hudson played the role, not just on screen, but in life. It wasn't until 1985, when Hudson became the first major celebrity to die from AIDS-related complications, that the veil was finally torn. His diagnosis shocked the world. His death changed it. Suddenly, AIDS wasn't just a distant crisis. It had a face. A famous one. But perhaps most tragically, Rock Hudson never lived to see a world where he could have simply been himself. His legacy, once defined by a lie, has since been reclaimed. Today, he's remembered not just for the roles he played, but for the courage it took to live quietly and the impact his death had on public awareness and compassion. Rock Hudson's greatest performance wasn't in film. It was surviving as himself in a world that would never have accepted him. Rita Hworth, the star who erased her heritage. She was the ultimate bombshell of the 1940s, seductive, elegant, magnetic. When Rita Hworth danced her way into cinema history in Gilda, she became the fantasy of an entire generation. But the woman who captivated millions wasn't born Rita Hworth. And the truth she buried reveals a painful commentary on identity, erasure, and survival in old Hollywood. Born Margarita Carmen Cancino to a Spanish father and Irish-American mother, Hworth was raised in a family of dancers. Her father, Eduardo Cancino, had been grooming her for the stage from a young age, and by her teens, she was performing in nightclubs. But when the Hollywood studios came calling, they didn't want a Margarita. They wanted someone more American. So the transformation began. Her hairline was painfully electrolyzed to give her a higher forehead, closer to the Caucasian beauty ideal. Her naturally dark hair was dyed auburn. Her name, identity, and ethnic roots were systematically stripped away. Margarita became Rita. Cancino became Hworth, a fabricated surname borrowed from her mother's side to sound more Anglo. For Rita, assimilation wasn't a choice. It was the price of entry. Despite her success, she always carried the weight of this reinvention. Privately, she lamented the studio's demand to conceal her Latin heritage. "I was treated like a thing," she once confided, "a commodity, not a person." The Hollywood system didn't celebrate her roots, it erased them. Ironically, while she became the poster girl for sensual glamour, her personal life was marked by isolation, exploitation, and heartbreak. 5 marriages, including one to Prince Ali Khan, couldn't give her peace. And when her memory began to slip, years before her Alzheimer's diagnosis was known to the public, it was as if the world that had stolen her identity had also begun to erase her entirely. Rita Hworth died in 1987, a legend on screen, a ghost off it. Her story is a haunting reminder. In Hollywood's golden age, even being yourself could be the biggest risk of all. 3. Carrie Grant, the polished icon with a hidden past. To audiences, Cary Grant was the pinnacle of charm, refined, witty, unflappable. With that transatlantic accent, tailored suits, and effortless grace, he seemed born to be a star. But the man behind the suave persona wasn't just hiding where he came from, he was hiding who he truly was. Cary Grant wasn't his real name. He was born Archibald Alexander Leach in Bristol, England, to a working-class family shrouded in poverty and trauma. His father was an alcoholic, and his mother, plagued by mental illness, was suddenly institutionalized when Archie was just 11. For years, he believed she was dead. It wasn't until he was 31 that he learned the truth. She was still alive, locked away in an asylum. His father had lied. That rupture with his past haunted him. So when he arrived in America determined to break into vaudeville and later Hollywood, he did what many in his position did. He reinvented himself. Archibald Leach was too rough, too British, too real. Cary Grant, however, sounded like a gentleman, a fantasy, a man untouched by pain. And that fantasy sold. But questions about Grant's personal life never stopped. His longtime companionship and cohabitation with actor Randolph Scott raised eyebrows. While studios carefully planted stories of romances with actresses, many insiders believed Grant was either gay or bisexual. Yet he never publicly acknowledged this, and never would. He married 5 times, but none of the unions seemed to last. His daughter, Jennifer Grant, once said, "My father was notoriously private. He didn't explain himself to others." Later in life, Grant underwent therapy and became an advocate of LSD-assisted psychotherapy, seeking healing from the ghosts of his past. But even in his old age, the line between Cary and Archie remained stark. "I pretended to be somebody I wanted to be," he once said. "I became that person. Or he became me, or we met at some point." Cary Grant may have mastered the art of becoming someone else, but behind the legend was always the boy who'd been left behind. 4. Merl Oberon, the star who hid her race for a lifetime. Merl Oberon was the epitome of ethereal beauty. With her luminous skin and enigmatic presence, she lit up the screen in classics like Wuthering Heights and The Scarlet Pimpernel. To the world, she was the refined English rose, a symbol of British cinematic elegance. But Merl Oberon's true identity was a carefully constructed illusion, one she guarded with painstaking effort her entire life. She claimed to have been born in Tasmania to British parents, but that was a lie. One orchestrated not only by herself, but by an entire studio system that could not tolerate a woman of mixed race in leading roles. The truth was that Merl was born Estelle Merl O'Brien Thompson in Bombay, India, to a Sri Lankan mother and a British father, or possibly a British stepfather. Her maternal grandmother, dark-skinned and unmistakably South Asian, was presented to the world as her maid. From a young age, Merl understood that her background was dangerous currency in an industry obsessed with racial purity. She began to lighten her skin with makeup and avoid the sun to maintain her fair complexion. When she moved to England, she reinvented her backstory entirely, claiming Tasmanian birth, inventing British lineage, and omitting her time in India. The deception worked. She became the first actress of Asian descent to be nominated for an Academy Award, though no one knew it. Even her lovers, including famed cinematographer Lucien Ballard, whom she later married, were kept in the dark for years. Studio photographers altered images to keep her whiteness consistent under every lighting condition. In private, the stress of her double life weighed heavily. She feared exposure constantly. Friends noted her paranoia, her reluctance to speak about her past, and her deep discomfort around questions of origin. It wasn't until decades after her death in 1979 that the full truth came out, through biographical investigations and recovered documents. Merl Oberon didn't just hide her identity. She erased it, because the world she conquered would have rejected the woman she truly was. 5. Raymond Burr, the crime solver who lived a fabricated life. To generations of television audiences, Raymond Burr was the embodiment of justice. As Perry Mason, he cracked impossible cases with steely precision. As Ironside, he brought dignity to the disabled detective. On screen, Burr was authoritative, composed, and morally unshakable. But off-screen, he lived inside one of Hollywood's most elaborate personal mythologies. Raymond Burr didn't just keep secrets. He created an entire fictional life. In interviews throughout his career, Burr claimed to have endured a series of unimaginable tragedies. A young wife who died of cancer, a child who died in infancy, and even military service that left him gravely injured. But none of it was true. No wife, no son, no war wounds. So why the lies? Burr was a deeply private man, and for good reason. He was gay in an era when being out could mean the end of a career. Unlike other stars who maintained plausible deniability, Burr went further, constructing a dramatic, grief-stricken personal narrative to keep the press from probing too closely into his real life. His long-term partner, actor and gardener Robert Benavides, was often referred to as Burr's business associate. They shared a home, a vineyard, and decades of life together. Yet Burr never acknowledged him publicly as anything more than a colleague. Even after his death in 1993, much of Burr's myth remained intact until biographers and journalists began digging into inconsistencies. As they unraveled the truth, a complex portrait emerged. A man who used fiction to protect love, a man whose need for privacy led him to rewrite his entire history. What makes Burr's case particularly haunting is how unnecessary the lies seem today. But in his time, they were a form of survival. His on-screen personas represented justice and truth, but his own truth had to remain locked away. Raymond Burr didn't just act in dramas, he lived in one. And the character he played best may have been the one the world never got to see. 6. Hedi Lamar, the glamour queen with a genius mind. To the movie-going public, Hedi Lamar was one of the most beautiful women ever to grace the screen. Dubbed the most beautiful woman in the world, she mesmerized audiences in films like Samson and Delilah and Ecstasy. With her sculpted features and alluring accent, she became a symbol of old Hollywood elegance. But Lamar carried a secret the industry never wanted to embrace. She was a scientific genius. Behind the carefully painted lips and studio-designed wardrobe was a restless intellect, one that Hollywood didn't know what to do with. While producers marketed her as an exotic seductress, Lamar was, in her spare time, inventing technology decades ahead of its time. During World War II, disturbed by reports of German U-boat attacks, she co-invented a frequency-hopping system designed to prevent torpedoes from being jammed by enemy signals. The technology, developed alongside composer George Antheil, was so sophisticated that the U.S. Navy initially dismissed it as too complex. It wouldn't be used in her lifetime, but decades later, it became the foundation for modern Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Yet, at the time, no one took her seriously. The studio heads certainly didn't. She was expected to show up on set, be photographed in furs, and smile for publicity stills, not to tinker with radio waves or challenge the limits of military engineering. And so, her scientific life became a hidden one. Few knew of her patents. Even fewer cared. For much of her life, Lamar battled feelings of isolation and disillusionment. "The brains of people are more interesting than the looks," she once said bitterly, "but Hollywood made me just a decorative thing." She would eventually receive recognition for her inventions, late in life and mostly posthumously. But the split between who she truly was and who Hollywood allowed her to be left a permanent mark. Hedi Lamar didn't hide her intelligence. Hollywood ignored it. And in doing so, the world nearly forgot that one of its greatest beauties was also one of its greatest minds. 7. Anthony Perkins, the horror icon, haunted by his hidden truth. Most people remember Anthony Perkins for a single role, Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, the boyish charm turned chilling stare. The soft-spoken voice masking something far more disturbing. It was a performance that redefined horror and one that would eerily mirror the double life Perkins was forced to live. In public, Perkins was the sensitive leading man, a heartthrob of the 1950s and 60s. But behind closed doors, he was a closeted gay man, navigating a hostile industry that equated queerness with scandal, weakness, or worse, career death. Despite early acclaim, including an Academy Award nomination for Friendly Persuasion, Perkins was warned repeatedly to suppress any hint of his sexuality. Studios paired him with actresses for photo ops, planted stories in tabloids, and encouraged an image of wholesome American masculinity. But Perkins was living a lie. For years, he engaged in secret relationships, some with fellow actors, others with artists and intellectuals who existed on the margins of the Hollywood system. One of his long-term companions was choreographer Grover Dale, a relationship that remained completely hidden from public view. Later in life, Perhaps weary of the burden, Perkins married photographer Barry Berenson and had 2 sons. Some believed this was a final attempt to escape the cage of speculation. Others felt it was an act of profound emotional complexity, perhaps even love in its own way. But the secrecy remained. When Perkins died in 1992 from AIDS-related complications, the news sent shockwaves through Hollywood. He had never publicly acknowledged his illness or his sexuality. Even in death, he was still protecting the myth. His widow, Barry, would tragically die 9 years later aboard American Airlines Flight 11 during the September 11 attacks. Today, Anthony Perkins is remembered not only for his haunting portrayal of Norman Bates, but as a symbol of the pain inflicted by decades of forced silence. In the shadows of a horror film legend lived a man denied the freedom to be himself. And that, perhaps, was the real tragedy. 8. Joan Crawford, the reinvented woman who buried her past. Few stars in old Hollywood mastered self-transformation like Joan Crawford. With her commanding screen presence, razor-sharp cheekbones, and unrelenting ambition, she rose from flapper roles in the silent era to Oscar-winning prestige. But the woman known as Joan Crawford was a fiction built on layers of buried truth, fabrication, and fierce control. To begin with, Joan Crawford wasn't even her name. She was born Lucille Fay Lesueur, a girl raised in poverty with an absent father, a string of abusive stepfathers, and little formal education. By the time she reached Hollywood, studio heads at MGM decided her name sounded too vulgar. Lesueur sounded like sewer, one executive quipped. A fan magazine contest renamed her Joan Crawford against her will. From there, the erasure deepened. Her birth year was falsified repeatedly to make her appear younger. Her early years as a dancer in seedy nightclubs were scrubbed from studio biographies. Even her relationship with her mother became strained as she tried to distance herself from her impoverished beginnings. Crawford became obsessed with control of her image, her home, her public life. She famously adopted a glamorous, aristocratic persona, even though she had come from the streets. And perhaps most tragically, that same obsession extended into her private life. Her adopted children later claimed she was a harsh, even abusive mother, accusations that exploded after the publication of Mommy Dearest by her daughter Christina. But who was Joan Crawford, really? To some, she was a woman fighting to escape the trauma of a brutal childhood in a world that punished vulnerability. To others, she was the ultimate self-made illusionist, someone who buried the truth so deeply that not even she could find it again. Joan herself once said, "If you want to see the girl next door, go next door." She had no interest in being relatable, only legendary. Her life wasn't a lie. It was a performance, one she never stepped out of. 9. Peter Lorre, the outsider who hid in plain sight. With his bulging eyes, peculiar voice, and unsettling calm, Peter Lorre became one of the most distinctive character actors in Hollywood history. From the psychotic child killer in M to the slippery underworld figures of Casablanca and the Maltese Falcon, Lorre was often cast as the other. Strange, suspicious, and foreign. But few realized just how much of an outsider he truly was. Behind his thick accent and mysterious persona was a man constantly fleeing from who he was and where he came from. Born Laszlo Lowenstein in Austria-Hungary to Jewish parents, Lorre began life under a name and heritage that would soon become a liability in a world racing toward fascism. As Hitler rose to power, Lorre, then working in Germany, was marked. Not only was he Jewish, but he had achieved fame playing a child murderer in M, 1931, a film that Nazi officials later banned. He fled to Paris, then to London, and finally to the United States, where he anglicized his name and suppressed as much of his past as he could. He never spoke publicly about his Jewish identity during his Hollywood career, nor did he address the trauma of displacement, anti-Semitism, and cultural loss. In a strange twist of fate, the Hollywood system that once welcomed him began to imprison him in its own way. He was forever the sinister foreigner, the villain, the drug addict, the coward. Studios flattened him into a stereotype and never allowed the world to see his range or his pain. Even as he became a U.S. citizen, Lorre remained uneasy in his skin. He struggled with addiction, depression, and typecasting. At one point, he grew so disillusioned with Hollywood that he turned down roles entirely, retreating into obscurity. Only later did scholars and fans begin to reappraise him, not as a caricature, but as a man who used the roles available to him to reflect a deeper alienation. Peter Lorre didn't just play haunted men, he was one. Haunted by a past he couldn't escape and an industry that never truly let him belong. 10. Greta Garbo, the enigma who loved in silence. Greta Garbo didn't need words to hypnotize audiences. Her face, captured in chiaroscuro shadows, was a masterpiece of mystery. Her voice, when it finally debuted in talking pictures, was low, sultry, and unlike any other. And yet, no one truly knew Garbo. That was by design. From the moment she arrived in Hollywood from Sweden, Garbo was different. She avoided interviews, skipped premieres, and refused fan clubs. "I want to be alone," she famously said in Grand Hotel, a line so closely associated with her that it seemed autobiographical. But her isolation was more than eccentricity. It was a wall built to guard a deeply private truth. Throughout her life, Garbo never married. She was linked romantically to actors like John Gilbert, but insiders whispered a different story. Letters and memoirs have since revealed that Garbo likely had romantic relationships with women, most notably with actress Mercedes de Acosta, a writer and theater personality in New York. Their correspondence, partially published and partially hidden, suggests deep emotional intimacy. Garbo destroyed many of her own letters before her death, a final act of self-erasure meant to protect her secrets from the world. The studio system, aware of the rumors, worked hard to deflect them, carefully managing her image as the aloof, foreign goddess. Even in her later years, living as a recluse in Manhattan, she remained elusive. She took long walks alone, avoided cameras, and kept her past locked behind drawn curtains. When fans spotted her on the street, they often couldn't believe it. She had become more myth than woman. Garbo's refusal to explain herself wasn't just stubbornness. It was an act of defiance. In a world where stars were expected to bare their souls, she chose instead to guard hers with ferocity. And maybe that's why her image endures, not just because she was beautiful, but because she never let anyone claim her completely. Greta Garbo didn't hide behind a lie, she hid behind silence. And in doing so, she became immortal. 11. Bela Lugosi, the immigrant who hid his struggles in the shadows of a monster. For millions, Bela Lugosi was Dracula. With his thick accent, hypnotic gaze, and deliberate speech, he didn't just play the vampire, he became the vampire. But the image that cemented him as a horror icon also trapped him in a life of isolation, typecasting, and secret torment. Beneath the cape and elegance was a man who spent his entire American career hiding who he was, where he came from, and how much he was suffering. Born Bela Ferenc Dejo Blasco in Hungary, Lugosi was a decorated soldier and respected stage actor in his homeland. After fleeing the political turmoil of post-World War I Hungary, he was on the wrong side of a failed revolution. Lugosi arrived in the United States as a political refugee who barely spoke English. To American audiences, the accent he never lost became part of his mystique. But in private, Lugosi was constantly battling to be understood, linguistically and emotionally. He downplayed his past in Europe, rarely speaking about the trauma of war, exile, or the violence he'd seen. Hollywood didn't care where he came from, only that he could deliver terror on cue. After the success of Dracula, 1931, he was never able to escape its shadow. Studios refused to cast him in varied roles. He became the go-to foreign villain, always lurking in the background, always othered. His attempts to return to serious theater or even just varied film parts were ignored. The Hungarian actor who once played Hamlet was now little more than a ghost with a contract. What he didn't reveal publicly was that he was descending into morphine addiction, a habit born from chronic pain, possibly from injuries sustained in war or during the physically demanding Dracula stage productions. The addiction ravaged his health and career. Lugosi eventually became one of the first Hollywood stars to enter rehab publicly, but it was seen more as tabloid fodder than an act of courage. He died in near poverty, buried in his Dracula cape, a final symbol of how inseparably his real self had been consumed by the fantasy. Bela Lugosi's greatest performance wasn't Dracula. It was pretending, every day, that he wasn't already a man haunted by the world he'd left behind. Jean Peters, the leading lady who vanished herself. In the 1950s, Jean Peters was a rising star, graceful, intelligent, and captivating without needing to shout for attention. She held her own opposite Marlon Brando in Viva Zapata and was one of the few actresses ever able to keep the spotlight away from Marilyn Monroe in Niagara. Studios had plans for her: red carpets, magazine spreads, a place in the pantheon of Hollywood's elite. But Jean Peters had other plans. She wanted out, and she made sure the world would never truly know who she was. At the height of her fame, Peters walked away from Hollywood. No scandals, no breakdowns, just a quiet, sudden retreat. What most people didn't realize was that she was running toward a different kind of secret: Howard Hughes. In 1957, she married the reclusive billionaire, aviation mogul, and erratic genius. Their relationship had roots in the early 1940s, but once they wed, Peters disappeared from the public eye almost entirely. Unlike Hughes's other high-profile romantic entanglements, Jean wasn't used for headlines. In fact, Hughes, famously paranoid and controlling, demanded complete privacy. Peters complied. She gave up acting, turned down interviews, avoided cameras, and lived in almost monastic anonymity. Even after their divorce in 1971, she refused to capitalize on the connection. She never wrote a memoir, never sold her story, and rarely spoke of Hughes. Some biographers claim she was the only woman who could truly match Hughes in intellect, and the only one who didn't need his fame. She lived modestly after their split, refusing the limelight even when it came knocking. But the real mystery wasn't just her exit from Hollywood. It was how little anyone ever truly knew about her, before or after. Jean Peters left behind almost no public record of who she was off-screen. No grand confessions, no reinventions, no scandals. Just a quiet dignity and a life lived on her own terms. In a town obsessed with exposure, Jean Peters chose silence. And in doing so, she became one of the most unknowable icons of them all. 13. Paul Lynde, the comic genius who hid behind the laugh. He was the unmistakable voice behind animated villains, the king of the quip on Hollywood squares, and a scene stealer in films like Bye Bye Birdie. With his biting sarcasm, campy charm, and exaggerated delivery, Paul Lynde became one of television's most beloved funny men. But the persona audiences adored was only one side of the man, because Paul Lynde spent his entire career hiding a truth he was never allowed to speak. Lynde was a gay man in an industry and era that weaponized queerness as career suicide. Though his flamboyant style was a signature, and gay subtext followed many of his roles, he never officially came out, not because he was ashamed, but because the price of honesty was too high. Instead, Lynde became a master of coded humor, slipping double entendres and subversive jokes into family-friendly television. His spot at the center square of Hollywood squares gave him a platform to be slyly suggestive without ever confirming anything. Audiences laughed, perhaps suspecting the truth, but the unwritten rule remained: don't ask, don't tell. Off-screen, Lynde's life was more turbulent. Friends described him as lonely, often drinking heavily, and struggling with the disconnect between who he was and who he was allowed to be. The pressure of performing, of being on all the time, exacerbated his isolation. Though deeply loyal to those he trusted, he guarded his private life fiercely. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of his story is that Lynde longed for genuine connection, but felt the world wouldn't accept him unless he wore a mask of comedy. Even in death, he passed away in 1982 from a heart attack. He left behind no public statements, no declarations, no cathartic revelations. His silence wasn't consent, it was survival. In recent years, LGBTQ historians have re-examined Lynde's life with fresh compassion, recognizing the coded brilliance of his performances and the pain that often simmered beneath the laughs. Paul Lynde's greatest joke was the one he was forced to live, making everyone laugh while never being able to show them who he truly was. Forden, Loretta Young, the devout star who hid a child from the world. In the 1930s and 40s, Loretta Young was the embodiment of wholesome Hollywood glamour. With her delicate features, soft voice, and religious devotion, she became one of the most respected actresses of her time. Off-screen, she cultivated the image of a moral compass in a town often accused of sin. But Young held a secret that would not be fully revealed until decades after her death, a child born from an affair that had been erased from public memory. In 1935, Young starred alongside Clark Gable in The Call of the Wild. During production, the two engaged in a brief romance, one that resulted in Young's pregnancy. But Gable was married, and Young, raised Catholic, was terrified. The scandal could have destroyed both of their careers. So she disappeared. She vanished from the public eye, claiming illness, and gave birth to a daughter named Judy in secret. For more than a year, she kept the baby hidden. Eventually, she adopted her own child, staging a phony adoption through an orphanage to make it appear legal. Judy Lewis grew up never knowing the truth, always wondering why she didn't quite fit in. Judy looked strikingly like Clark Gable, with his prominent ears and unmistakable chin. The rumors swirled for years, but Loretta Young never publicly acknowledged Gable as the father, not even to her daughter. It wasn't until Judy was in her 30s that she finally confronted her mother, who quietly confirmed the truth. Still, Young insisted the story remain private until her death. Only in the 1990s did she allow biographers to publish her confession, one laced with sorrow, religious guilt, and the emotional damage of having to hide a child out of fear for her reputation and career. Judy Lewis would go on to write a memoir titled Uncommon Knowledge, detailing her journey through secrecy, confusion, and ultimate reconciliation. Loretta Young's most guarded performance wasn't in a film. It was in motherhood, hidden in shame, and kept in silence for nearly a lifetime. 15. George Reeves, the Superman who lived a secret life of doubt. To an entire generation of American children, George Reeves was Superman, the smiling, chiseled, moral hero who stood for truth, justice, and the American way. But behind the cape and confident grin was a man trapped in an image he didn't control, hiding both his inner torment and the complexities of a life that never fit the role he was forced to play. Long before he donned the Man of Steel's suit, Reeves had worked as a journeyman actor. He appeared in Gone with the Wind, albeit in a small role, and toiled for years in forgettable B-movies. His big break came in the 1950s when he was cast as Superman in Adventures of Superman, a show that made him a household name, but also a prisoner of typecasting. Producers refused to see him as anything other than Superman. Studios laughed off the idea that he could play serious or romantic roles. Children saw him as invincible, and parents expected him to act like the character in real life. Reeves, a sensitive and thoughtful man, grew despondent. But what few knew was the complicated secret behind the scenes. Reeves had been in a long-term relationship with Toni Mannix, the wife of MGM fixer Eddie Mannix, a man with rumored ties to organized crime and deep connections within the studio system. Though Toni genuinely loved Reeves and supported him financially and emotionally, their relationship was doomed by its very nature. When Reeves began seeing a younger woman, aspiring actress Leonore Lemmon, it created a storm of tension, jealousy, and whispered threats. Not long after, in 1959, Reeves was found dead in his home from a gunshot wound to the head. Officially ruled a suicide, the case left behind a swirl of unanswered questions, inconsistencies, and conspiracy theories that haunt Hollywood lore to this day. Was it self-inflicted despair, or was someone else involved? What's certain is that George Reeves never got to escape the shadow of Superman. His real self, introspective, ambitious, and quietly tormented, was buried beneath the cape. In the end, the man who made the world believe in heroes was crushed by the weight of pretending to be one. Sal Mineo, the teen idol who lived and died in the shadows. To the public, Sal Mineo was the sensitive, troubled youth of rebel without a cause, the boy whose quiet vulnerability made him a symbol of misunderstood adolescence in the 1950s. Nominated for an Academy Award at just 17, Mineo was hailed as one of the most promising young actors of his generation. But as Hollywood moved on from teen dramas, Mineo found himself increasingly trapped by both a career in decline and a truth he was forced to suppress. Sal Mineo was gay, a reality he knew from an early age, but one that was incompatible with the image studios had built for him. In the 1950s and 60s, being openly queer in Hollywood was a career death sentence. So Mineo kept his personal life quiet, dating women publicly, while living a much different truth in private. As roles dried up, he became one of many Golden Age stars discarded once they no longer fit the mold. His youthful looks, once an asset, now worked against him. He struggled financially and professionally and was repeatedly turned down for roles that might have revived his career. But behind the scenes, Mineo was quietly living more authentically. He began directing theater, including productions that addressed themes of sexuality and identity, subtly pushing boundaries that Hollywood still refused to acknowledge. In the final years of his life, he had begun to speak more openly among friends about his orientation and seemed poised for a modest comeback. He landed a part in a new play, was in a stable relationship, and was finally embracing the parts of himself he had long been forced to hide. Then, in 1976, he was stabbed to death in an alley behind his apartment, a violent, senseless murder that sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Initial speculation wrongly connected the crime to his sexuality, further stigmatizing his memory. Only later was it revealed to be a random robbery by a stranger. Mineo's life was brief, brilliant, and heartbreakingly constrained by the limits of his time. He was a star who dared to live honestly, just as the world was finally ready to hear the truth. 7. Ramon Novaro, the Silent Era. Heartthrob silenced by his truth. In the 1920s, Ramon Novaro was everything Hollywood adored. Exotic, handsome, brooding. As the dashing lead in Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ, 1925, he captivated audiences and studios alike. For a time, he was considered a serious rival to Rudolph Valentino, and MGM marketed him as a romantic symbol of Latin passion. But Novaro's image was built on illusion, because the man beneath the toga and matinee idol charm was living a life of concealment, fear, and deep personal conflict. Novaro was gay, and in the Hollywood of the silent era and the conservative studios of the 1930s, it was a reality that had to be hidden at all costs. Catholic guilt, career pressure, and the threat of exposure shaped every decision in his life. He remained unmarried, avoided romantic entanglements in public, and carefully curated a public persona built on mystery and mystique. Privately, Novaro struggled. He confided in close friends about the burden of secrecy and his longing for love without shame. But Hollywood offered him no safe space. As his stardom faded with the rise of talkies and changing tastes, he was increasingly isolated, professionally and emotionally. His tragic end came not from scandal, but from brutality. In 1968, at the age of 69, Novaro was murdered in his own home by two brothers he had reportedly hired for companionship. They believed he had hidden cash in the house, and after torturing him for hours, they killed him, leaving his body broken and his legacy tainted by sensationalist headlines. The tabloids feasted on the details. His sexuality, long whispered about, was dragged into the open in the most horrifying way possible. What should have been a dignified legacy was reduced to lurid scandal. It took decades for his contributions to cinema to be fully reevaluated, separating the art from the cruelty of the way he was remembered. Ramon Novaro gave the world beauty, grace, and pioneering stardom, but in the end, his truth cost him everything.